Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to go back to the well of the Marvel podcast to get primary information about why we should be fighting for things like storytelling and why it is a front on this culture war. Now, the reason why I go back to these podcasts most of the time is because, well, they like to talk and they just say things right out, but it gives me, as I said, primary information. I'm not pulling things out of my hat. A bunch of my subscribers make a joke about the fact that I say again all the time. It's like a drinking game. Every time I say the word again, take a drink. But there's a reason why I say the word again. It's because even though I might not be talking about it in this specific video, I have talked about it before, and I have primary sources for what I am saying. That's why I say again, I'm referring back to my old videos because all of those pieces of information are still stuck in my head. And if you want to go look for them through my video selection, you can find them as well. And I do try at points to put those links in the description for the videos that I have done upon those subjects and successively the podcasts from which I usually get these things or the articles or such and such, which I'll do again today. This is from a Marvel podcast. I will link that in the description and I'll give you the name and the episode number for it as well because Marvel tends to shift these things around so much that the link sometimes no longer works if you're listening to this a year or more since I actually came across this thing. So what I want to talk about today is a podcast from Marvel called The Magic of Marvel, Witches in Marvel and History. And some of you may be asking why I concentrate on this subject so much, because it was only about 6 months ago, less than that, I think, that I did a video about magic. There was a couple that I did a couple of years ago, one about a book con that Marvel was heavily invested in, where a lot of the talks that they were putting on was about witchcraft and adjacent kind of ideas. And I can't even remember how many I've done on this subject. But the reason why I concentrate on this subject is because these people who write these stories and do storytelling in this way concentrate so much on this subject. And today I'm going to do this one a little bit different because usually I give you a thesis at the first and then build up my evidence for my thesis and then give it again at the end. But I'm going to give you my thesis right at the first and have you pick out, because I think you can really pick out from what I'm going to read from this podcast, what exactly I'm talking about. And what this podcast really is about witchcraft equaling feminism. And really, that's my thesis as well. Witchcraft and feminism are tied together extremely closely. And honestly, I think one leads to the other. And that's not just me saying that, that's the women in this podcast saying it as well. But of course, we have to remember that the reason why I'm going over this is because these are the type of people who are creating stories for pop culture right now. So let's get right into it. It is a podcast where it is divided into 3 parts. There are 3 interviews with this podcast. The interviewers, there are 3. There is Ellie Pyle, Angelique Roche, and Judy Stevens. And again, this is one of the Women of Marvel podcasts. And first of all, how does this have any impact on the comics that are being put out? Well, just a month ago or a couple of months ago was one of the first Women of Marvel comics that came out. And I've done videos about how they declare this is a woman-only space. That is to say, only women work on these books. Women are the colorists. Women are the ones who write it. Women are the ones who draw it. They want the women to be the one who press the button so that it goes to print. All these kinds of things. And in that book that just came out about a month ago, which is a comic book, they also have inserted within these little stories that are in the comic these exact interviews or snippets from these interviews that they do. And also, besides that, they have a hardcover book coming out from the Women of Marvel podcast. I think that's later on this year. And I do believe that's a series of books. And not to mention, they always have these as part of the Comic-Con. This is one of their major panels whenever Marvel puts on panels at Comic-Con. And again, to mention the fact that the second in command, the person who is now gone from Marvel, which would be Sana Amanat, the person who was in control of character development and content for almost 10 years, she was the one who created this podcast. So yes, it does have some relevance, not only on what Marvel is putting out within the comics, within other formats, but also within the mindset of how the people who run Marvel actually think. And this podcast is separated into 3 parts. They have 3 different interviews. but I'm only going to really concentrate on the first. The first is a professor talking about witchcraft and history. The second one is someone who is a curator of the Salem Witch Museum. And the third one is a writer for Marvel talking about the character that she has dealt with that is a witch within Marvel Comics. And as I said, I'm going to concentrate on that first interview because really it has enough meat on the bone to get at the subject matter that I'm going to discuss. First off, at the beginning of the podcast, you have one of the presenters, Ellie Pyle, saying that witchcraft is something very close to her heart. And they introduce this topic as saying it's about Marvel characters, about witches in pop culture more broadly, and how that compares to witchcraft in actual history. They are doing this through an interview with a woman named Beth Pollard. She is, and I quote, a history professor at San Diego State University. She researches classical witchcraft and how older archetypes show up in modern pop culture, specifically in comics. And yes, I know some of you are rolling your eyes that this is what a professor actually studies, but no, that's the stated thing that she studies within this podcast. And trust me, I've seen much more ridiculous than that. And then after that introduction, one of the other people who is running this podcast, who is Angelique Rocher, says, I'm so excited right now. I know you're going to be talking about witches and about pop culture and feminism and how everything shifts in how we see witches. And that's just really, really incredible. And then the other presenter, who is Judy Stevens, says, yeah, I wish I had a class like this in school. I would have loved to learn about this stuff, right? And I give you that because, one, I want to show you not just their acceptance of these ideas, but their excitement for these ideas, and how they themselves, the people who work for Marvel and run this podcast, tie together witchcraft, pop culture, and feminism. And so they bring in the professor who says she's a huge Marvel fan. Now, what does that mean? Well, I'll give you my 2 cents on that. I think she's a huge Marvel fan of the shows and movies that Marvel puts out. Yes, she does seem to have some knowledge of the comics, but it seems to be mostly recent comics. From what she says, she's a little bit, well, let's just say unaware of the history of Marvel and only does basic research in order to see those things. That's my 2 cents. So take that for what it's worth. And so I want to give you a statement from this woman, from this professor, so that you can see exactly what she's talking about and how she views this subject. Now I'm going to interject just a few times within this large quote, but hopefully that won't be too distracting from the main topic of what is being discussed. So she starts off by saying, in graduate school, I had what I call my feminist epiphany. And I decided what I wanted to do was to look at women's expressions of power through religion. Now, once again, I want to stress, as I have so many times in the past, everything for these people revolves around power. And by the way, what does she mean by religion? Well, she doesn't mean what you and I would think of as religion. She is talking a little bit about ancient Roman religion, but what she really does, as she says later in the podcast, is that she goes through spell books to see what women were trying to do to cast spells. That's what she classifies as religion. And by the way, she connects this with comics because she says those old spell books that she goes through have a relationship between words and images. And also I have to note, of course, that the way she begins, this is her first statement within this interview, the way she begins is by categorizing everything under the fact that she says this was from her feminist epiphany. So, quite definitely, this is through the lens of feminism. This is not me making wild accusations. This is her stating it outright, just as the presenters have stated it outright. She goes on to say, and because of that, I started to look at women's use of magic in antiquity. So I looked at Roman witches, essentially, and the heart of my research was looking at representations, so fiction, art, history, narrative, and what women might do that might be called witchcraft, and then the reality. I just want to point out very briefly, you noticed how she doesn't say history. She says historical narrative. This is a direct indication that she is on the far left of the spectrum in looking at anything in an academic way, because relegating things to a historical narrative is an idea that comes from the socialist and communist ideological talking points, not from academia itself. It's kind of like critical race theory. You know how they say you need to look at everything in academia through this lens. That's the exact same thing that she's doing right here by calling it a historical narrative instead of history. Now, I suppose someone could make the claim that she's going deep into modern philosophical thought in order to pull out that phrase, but since she qualified everything under feminism, the far left-wing ideological way of using that term would be much more appropriate and much closer to what she's speaking about. So she goes on to say, and I'll recap just a little bit, of what women might do that might be called witchcraft, and then the reality. So actual spells that women might use. And so imaginings of witches versus what women were really doing that might get them accused of being a witch. So it's not that much of a jump from that to looking at representations of witches in modern comics. And that added layer of, are there similarities there because the modern comic makers are drawing intentionally on ancient stereotypes? Or is it just that archetypes work really well? A scary woman in the woods, a vixen enchantress, a woman who just wants power. So that's the end of our introductory quote, but I just have to point out, I find it hilarious how these people constantly talk about power and how women should be powerful and get power from this and that. And then out of the other side of their mouth, they talk about this as a bad thing, or at the very least, how it's bad to represent women as just wanting power. So the very meat of what she has to say comes next, and it is from this point in the podcast and sprinkled throughout what she also has to say. She gives what she calls a model for witches, basically what witches are, how they are viewed. And as I give you this list of how she sees them and has studied them historically as being represented throughout history as compared with how they actually existed throughout history, or at the very least the historical narrative, quite honestly for me, and I think it might be for you as well, just a list, a checking off the boxes of describing modern feminism and modern women within the far left, or even sometimes just the left of modern society. So she goes on to say, what were women doing in ancient fiction that would make them seem like witches? That's things like, oh my gosh, they do so many terrible things. And then she goes on to list these terrible things. And as I said, it's not just from this point in the podcast, but from later on as well. So I'll give you that list. She says they do things like transform men into various animals. And then later on the podcast, she talks about shape-shifting herself and others. They might mess with the weather and have, as she calls later, elemental control. They might threaten children, or threaten childbearing, or interfere with someone else's childbearing. They will gather noxious, creepy ingredients to work their spells. They do necromancy. By the way, necromancy is bringing dead things alive. Then she goes on to say, they do things that I probably can't say in a Marvel podcast. And then later on in the podcast, she adds to that list, crossing boundaries, threatening children or young women, attempting to maintain their own power at their own cost. They transgress relationships. And she qualifies that last one by saying, they get folks to love them, or they create erotic/romantic relationships where they aren't otherwise. She also says, they get in the midst of competition, especially competition between women. And also, they mush together magic and sexuality. And at the end, she talks about them having a deep reservoir of magical knowledge. Now, we'll get into that reservoir of magical knowledge in a minute. But I just want to add at the end of that list, she says within this podcast that these earmarks for a witch, they're there from the earliest pop culture. So from Roman pop culture, and that's a quote from her. And she says, it's shocking how consistent this is over time. Now, I want to go over that list just briefly again, but adding my own 2 cents with each of these and looking at them through the lens of feminism, which again is not just me making things up. It's the way this woman herself says that she began thinking about these things, and also the presenters here who work for Marvel talking about the exact same thing, the connection between feminism and witchcraft. First off, she talks about transforming men into various animals, but later clarifies it, talking about shape-shifting themselves as well and others. Now, all I gotta say is personal pronouns, and you can figure out the connection between transforming people into non-people things. She talks about how they might mess with and control the weather, later calling this elemental control. Now just think about how feminism and something like, environmentalism, and how they're trying to put it into law, how to control the weather. Just make that connection in your head and see if it actually has some merit. She talks about threatening children, or threatening childbearing, or interfering with someone else's childbearing. And she does also talk about this later on in the podcast, where she talks about older women who are witches or seen as witches getting in the midst of childbearing women who are trying to balance their own roles and their own power. And so the witches take control of the bringing up of these children. And whether you like it or not, just think about the deep connection and the deep control that feminism wants over things like, what they call reproductive rights and the education and teaching of children. This ties in with what she says later about these witches transgressing relationships, how they get people to love them or people to love each other where they wouldn't naturally do so otherwise, and also get in the way in the midst of competition between women. And not only that, but the mushing together of magic and sexuality. Now just think for a minute how all of that is connected to modern feminism. And not just connected, but how it seems to be at the center and core of modern feminism. The control of relationships, the control of sexuality, the control of how people interact with each other romantically, etc., etc. And also on that list is crossing boundaries. And again, how much do I have to say to think about the modern far left and feminism and how many boundaries they have crossed, and how they seem to think it a badge of honor to cross boundaries that should not be crossed. And I think all of this is summed up by one of those things on the list, which she says, attempting to maintain their own power at their own cost. Now we'll talk about that own cost in a minute, but really it's about maintaining power. You see, the positive and the negative of how she speaks about these things, of how she talks about them in a historical sense, and how they are viewed as being negative, she sees them as being a positive if it enhances the actual power of women. But the one that I want to concentrate on right now, and that ties into at their own cost point, is she talks about a deep reservoir of magic knowledge. Now, what exactly does she mean by this? Well, it's connected to that last point that I just talked about. She says, and I quote, "It often boils down to women who are deemed to be scary because they are trying to claim some kind of power for themselves." And again, always about power. But where does this idea of power come from, and them getting power? Well, it comes from a very left-leaning idea that it comes from innovation instead of looking at things in the past or looking at how nature actually works. No, it comes from the inside and from new ideas. And she goes on to talk about this by discussing one of the characters from The Runaways, who is Nico Minori. The character is based upon this magical ability. She has what is called the Staff of One, and she can never cast the same spell twice. She can only cast it once and then has to come up with a new spell. And she goes on and describes this as saying, her ritual expertise has to come not from an existing body of knowledge that she is repeating and refining, but from her own innovation on the spot, coming up with a clever way to achieve the outcome. And then she goes on to discuss how this is a female thing as opposed to a male thing. First, she says, it syncs up with the ancient world. If women use some kind of ritual power to get the power of a man, she is going to be accused of being a witch. And then she goes on to talk about Doctor Strange and how Doctor Strange is different from the other Marvel characters who are female, who are witches. She says that the way Doctor Strange gets his powers is a male way of getting powers. That is to say, he trains with a teacher and over time learns these very clear ways of acting to achieve the manipulation of reality that he is able to achieve. And she contrasts that with other characters like Scarlet Witch and Agatha Harkness, being women, and says it's more organic for them. It's asking them to dig into themselves to find that power. It's not about book learning or manipulation or practice, but it's about digging into self and manifesting the power out of one's own being. And then she goes on to say, are you marshalling something from the outside and putting it to a particular purpose, or that which you generate from within? And I do think there is a gendered component there. And so she links the external to the male as opposed to the internal for the female. And in the rest of the podcast, she says a number of times that the way this gets passed down is from an older witch giving it to a younger woman. That is to say, as she says, witches come in pairs. So it's not writing things down and refining it and studying it. No, it's knowledge passed down from one woman to another. You see how it's gynocentric and excludes men from the entire equation? Now, I want to go back and look at that just for a minute, but that's the end, really, of the podcast, or at the very least, her part in the podcast. Then it moves on to the woman who is the curator of the museum for the Salem witch trials. And quite honestly, even though I'm not going to go into it, I have to mention this. This little bit is basically apologetics for witchcraft. They introduce it by saying they're going to talk about witches persecuted in the Salem witch trials. And yes, even in the body of this little part of the interview, they talk about how one of these women, who at the first actually got accused of being a witch in the Salem witch trials, they admit and state within this podcast, the person who is the curator of the museum says, yeah, she probably was practicing some witchcraft. But they see this still as being a bad thing. Well, perhaps it was a bad thing that they put her to death, but the point is, again, it's apologetics for witchcraft. But I want to go back to what they were saying about this gender difference within the use of what she calls magic between men and women. If you look at what she describes as being the course of male magic and witchcraft, she's really just talking about proto-science. Honestly, while doing my degrees, I took history courses in science, how science developed, and also political theory courses on the ideas behind science. And some of the things that you study, the precursor to these things are stuff like alchemy, because that's the precursor to a lot of science and the scientific method and things like that. But what she's describing as being the male magic is just proto-science. She talks about having a teacher who teaches you over time to learn very clear ways of acting and achieving the manipulation of reality. Now, I'm not talking about the manipulation of reality itself. I'm talking about the manipulation of nature, but it's basically the same thing when you look at it and just substitute reality for nature. That's what science is. And honestly, that's what logic is all about. Where you get science to begin with is that you take these things in nature and you find out how they interact with each other in very clear and defined ways, and you learn over time how these lesser truths or well-known truths lead to greater truths about reality and how to control what is going on within reality. And again, how does she talk about this kind of manipulation as it has to concern women? Well, it all comes from the inside. It's all drawn from within, and you're supposed to manipulate reality from the power that is within. And again, you can see, if you think about it even for a couple of seconds, how this is so well connected with modern feminism. The idea that you can, by just the power of your will, manipulate reality. That is to say, things like words and how you can manipulate how they actually are expressed and what their definitions are. Not that they are connected to reality like they used to be, but that you can manipulate them through your will. Or the fact that you can manipulate reality in saying, I am this, I am that, and you must acknowledge that reality because I think it's so, and that is real. And so I want to take all of that and move on from what she has said and use it for a basis to argue exactly what I'm always arguing. If you look historically at the way that people actually get power, you'll see that it comes from something that is not a manipulation that comes through the will, but is exactly what she is talking about as being the male way to power, which is to say, it goes back to things like logic. And you understand what is going on within reality, and you get to manipulate what actually happens within the reality that is in front of you, or the nature that is expressed at the very least in front of you. But let's look just for a minute at how that actually occurs within the time periods that she is discussing. Traditionally, and for the majority of Western civilization, when people seek power for its own ends, it ends in a bad way. Why? Because power is not something you can control by itself. Power is a byproduct of something else. And what is it a byproduct of? It is a byproduct of virtue. If you look at the very beginnings, again, going back to prior to what she's talking about, going back to the Greeks, the idea of virtue is first you got to have right reason, and then that leads into the first virtue, which is prudence. Well, what is right reason? Well, right reason is you taking your reason and conforming it to what reality actually is. And then from that step, you can move into prudence, which is a virtue in itself, the charioteers of all the virtues, which is to say, I can make actual good decisions because I know how nature and reality around me work, and therefore I can conform my actions with that reality and then get the power to actually accomplish the ends that I set out or that are set out for me. That is to say, I accomplish my ends. I have the power to accomplish my ends because I acknowledge the limitations of the nature and reality around me. And as I said, within that way of thinking, power itself is simply a byproduct of something else. It is a byproduct of a system that must be well understood, that you must study in order to understand really fully. You can innately understand it, but you won't be able to manipulate, or at the very least, control the things in front of you in a very dexterous way if you do so. And this comes down to what we're talking about right here. This comes down to art, because that's exactly what the ancients and the medievals, so most of Western civilization, declared as being art. Your ability to take a image that's in your mind and to put it into external reality. And the only way that you can do that is to understand the rules of how external reality work and how you work with external reality. Once again, coming down to those ideas of right reason and the virtue, again, which can be defined as the power to accomplish one's ends, how you can use all of that information and knowledge that you learn, whether it's through book learning or the life of hard knocks, doesn't matter. You learn it and then you put it into practice in this way. But for these people, like these women, not just the people who are talking that are being interviewed, but the presenters themselves, they're always talking about grasping on to power, not as if it was a byproduct of something like virtue. Quite the opposite. They're talking about a vicious way, that is to say, a way filled with vice of grasping on to power. They wish the power of the will to control reality itself, or at the very least, the reality of their lives. And they want to do it directly through the will. They want that power without having to go through the succeeding steps and processes and pains of actually having the right, the natural right to use that power. And by the way, I call it vicious, I call it vice, because that's the definition of vice, that which is opposed to nature. And this is why I think these kinds of ideas are so massively dangerous. especially if they're being put into pop culture and everyone is lapping them up because that's the only kind of story that you can get within pop culture right now. At the heart of everything they discuss and describe and write stories about is the idea that they can wrest control of reality itself through the power of their own will. And that, straight up, is a villain, even though these stories present these protagonists as if they were the heroes. And that is always the downfall of this type of ideology. You see, these people have no access to power themselves. No wonder they're always talking about themselves as being victims. They have no power. Why? Because they don't want to go through the steps of being virtuous in order to get that byproduct of power. They want power directly. And really, the only way that they can get it, since they don't have access to it, since they're not virtuous, is to usurp the power of people who are virtuous, is to usurp the power of people who actually follow the rules of reality. And the thing being that as they gain more and more control over that power, and they put forward the idea that they are the majority, that they and the way that they think is the way that everyone else should think, you get less and less people who are virtuous, and that is to say less and less people with actual power that they have access to, and therefore less and less power these people can usurp. And at the heart of it, this is why everything that is based upon these ideas turns into a tyranny. It's because as they become more and more successful, they have less and less power to maintain the control that they must have in order to extract the power from others, to usurp the power that other people actually have access to. And so I have no doubt that this type of power grab that we see around us over and over again today is going to eventually fail. The question really becomes, how much suffering and misery are these people going to inflict upon the world before the rest of us become heroic enough to tell them that I am done being manipulated? So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. All right, I'll see you later. Bye.